Okay, we'll start in 2 minutes. Oh.
All right. Yes, there we go. Okay.
Good to go?
I think so.
Okay, so let's get started. Welcome to the session on functional encryption. You have, I guess, 2 parts, right? Four talks. And the first talk is going to be on streaming functional encryption by Jacqueline One, Alexis Orb, and Hi, and Alexis is going to talk.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So yeah, this is my talk on streaming functional encryption, which is joint work with Josh and Amit. And so before I define streaming functional encryption, let me just define regular functional encryption. So in the functional encryption scheme, an adversary can generate a master secret key and a master public key. And then using the master secret key, they can create function keys for functions of their choice. So here the green user got a function key for F1. And then anyone who has the master public key can encrypt some message X. And the correctness property we want is that given a function key for F and an encryption of some message X, then the user should be able to learn F of X. So here, for example, the green user learned F1 of X with a function key for F1. And for security, what we want is that the user learns nothing more than F of X. So the way we kind of quantify this is through a security game. So we'll consider an adversary who has access to a master public key, along with function keys for functions of their choice. And then they are given either an encryption of X0 or an encryption of X1. And they have to decide which is which, as long as F of X0 equals F of X1 for all function keys that the adversary has access to. And what does this mean, really, if the adversary doesn't learn much more than, F of X? Well, what we say is, if you give you an encryption of X, you can secretly swap it out with any different X, as long as the function values have the same output value. So that's what we have here for indistinguishability, basically. Okay. So functional encryption has quite a lot of uses. One use case we'll look at is the following. So we consider Alice, who maybe represents a bunch of hospitals, and she has access to a lot of medical data. And then Bob comes along, and he has some machine learning algorithm for predicting whether or not patients have cancer. And what Alice would like to do is have Bob run this algorithm, but she simply sent all her data over to Bob, then that would violate patient privacy laws. So what Alice will do is that either her or maybe some government or some authority can create a functional encryption scheme. They can look at Bob's machine learning algorithm F, and if it looks reasonable, they can create a function key for that and send that over to Bob. So, and then Alice or anyone with the encryption key can encrypt their data. And if they send it over to Bob, then Bob can learn the function on the data, which in this case is the output of the machine learning algorithm. But Bob will otherwise learn nothing else about the encryption. So that will satisfy sort of the privacy laws that it has. So, you might be wondering, okay, why don't I just use, MPC or FHE or any other thing that you can use to generate such a thing? And one of the nice things about functional encryption is that it's very non-interactive. So once Alice sends over the encryption to Bob, she never has to talk to Bob ever again. So one of the advantages of using functional encryption in place of other crypto primitives that can do something similar is that it's non-interactive. Okay. So yeah, so this works. And one thing though is that if the data set is extremely large, then there might be problems. And the key problem really is that functional encryption requires that the entire data set is known at encryption time. So in particular, on Alice's end, suppose her data is extremely large. So maybe she represents multiple hospitals. Then in order to encrypt her data, she would have to compute on all the data of all the hospitals at once. And she might not have the computational resources to do that. Additionally, the data might not be all available at once. So for example, new patients may come in or come out, the data may change. And so Alice has no way of sort of like dealing with the changing data. When she wants to encrypt, she has to kind of take a snapshot of the current data she has. And then also the data might not be concurrently available. So for instance, if Alice had multiple businesses, they might have different uptimes on their servers. So really for Alice to encrypt, she has to have all her data in one place and be able to compute on it all at once. Similarly, Bob also has to have resources to compute on the entire data set because decryption takes time proportional to the entire data set Alice has. Also, Bob can't easily add new training data. So if a new hospital were to appear, then it would be difficult to sort of combine that new data with the old data without re-encrypting everything. And then finally, Bob won't be able to get any partial results. So Bob just waits till decryption finishes, and then he gets the final result, but he won't be able to get results. So to kind of solve these problems, what we'd rather have is a functional encryption system that lets you kind of compute on data as it arrives. So we want to build FE for iterative computation that works on data streams, where the idea is that as data becomes available, Alice and Bob can start this encrypting and decrypting process of computing on the data. And so that's what we do in this work, is we build a new type of FE, which we call streaming functional encryption, which will do exactly this. So before I define streaming functional encryption, let me just talk about what I mean by iterative computation. So we define a streaming function to be a stateful function. So it takes some data X, some input state, and outputs some output state along with some output Y. And because it's a stateful function, you can chain the computation together. So the output of the first computation could then be, the state can be fed as input state of the next one, and so on and so on. And just as some terminology, we will call all the X's the data string, and we will call all the Y's the output. So for our definition, the intermediate states will not be included as part of the output. So when we refer to the output of F on some data stream, we simply mean all the Y's that result from this iterative process. So just to give a brief example, suppose F is the majority function, and you're just trying to compute the majority of all the bits seen so far. So if you think of the X's as a data stream of bits, then it's easy to compute the majority of what you've seen so far. If your states that you're keeping track of, just keep a count of the zeros. And just as a note, also, it's possible to have two different data streams that have the same output values. So for a majority example, here are two data streams, X0 and X1, where if 0 is a tiebreaker, then the majority of the bits seen so far is 0 for both streams, even though the streams have different intermediate states and also different depths. So yeah, then the question is, well, what is streaming functional encryption? Well, it's simply functional encryption for streaming functions. So let me define that a little bit more thoroughly. Okay, so again, we have our authority who can generate a master secret key and a master public key. And then using the master secret key, they can create function keys for functions of their choice, where now the functions are these streaming functions that I just defined. So now how about encryption? So we have here Alice, who has a master public key. And in fact, Alice will need one more thing, which is what we call the encryption state. And the purpose of the encryption state is to link elements of the stream together. So there will be one encryption state for each stream. And what we don't want is to allow you to mix and match streams. So you shouldn't be able to take the ciphertext of one stream and then choose the ciphertext of the other stream and kind of mix and match. So this encryption state prevents that and is used to have sort of meaningful notions of security. But as far as implementation, it's very easy for Alice to generate this because anyone can create an encryption state using just a master public key. So it does not require a secret encryption. And now that Alice has all these things, her data starts arriving as a string. And as soon as she gets X1, the first element of the string, then she can generate an encryption at X1. And then she waits a bit more, some more data arrives, and now she can encrypt her second input X2, and so on and so forth. And so the nice thing here is that, Alice to encrypt X3 doesn't need to know what came before. She doesn't need to know what came afterwards. And in particular, she doesn't need to know how long the string will be before she starts the encryption process. All right. Then on Bob's end, Bob here has a function key for some streaming function F, along with some starting decryption states, which will be updated, but starts off as empty plot. And Bob starts to receive the ciphertext from Alice. So as soon as Bob gets the encryption of the first element of the string, then he can use this decryption state in his function key to learn Y1, which is the first output. So F of X1 state 1 is Y1 state. And then during this process, he will also update his decryption state. And you should think of the new decryption state as somehow encrypting state 2, since the intermediate states have to be hidden in this process. Then the next ciphertext arrives, and Bob can combine that with his new decryption state and get the next output Y2, and then update his decryption state. And he can keep it. So yeah, the nice thing here again is that Bob can start decrypting and getting the Y output values without knowing how long the string will be, or once he just gets the ciphertext for the values he gets up to this point. And in general, the efficiency property we want is that the runtime of all of our algorithms here do not depend on the total length of the string and can be run before you know how long it's going to take. So what is security? So what I have on the screen here is basically the same as before, and really the only changes in security are notational. So we consider a game where the adversary has a master public key along with function keys for functions of their choice. For now, again, the functions are streaming functions, and then the adversary receives either an encryption of X0 or X1, where now X0 and X1 are streams of data with n elements where n is chosen by the adversary. And so an encryption of stream X0 would simply be the set of ciphertext representing encryption of each element of the stream. Same with X1. So then what do we mean by the requirement that f of X stream X0 equals f of stream X1? Well, as a reminder, we mean that all the Y output values generated by the iterative process are the same. So the intermediate states may differ, but if you were to kind of compute the streaming process, then you would get the same Y values. And if this holds, then we say that it's secure if the adversary can't tell whether they got an encryption at X0 or X1. So again, like I said, this is sort of the same definition, except with some notational changes. So that brings us to back to our use case. So streaming FE solves these problems, since streaming FE would allow Alice and Bob to sort of start the encryption and processing part before Alice has all the data available and when it becomes available. So what are our results? Our main theorem is that assuming a compact functional encryption scheme for P over poly, then there exists a function selective streaming FE scheme for P over poly. So we're essentially creating a version of streaming FE from regular functional encryption. Before I define a couple extra of these terms, some of you might be thinking, okay, wait. So streaming functional encryption is this very iterative process. Well, what else is iterative? Turing machines. Turing machines have this sort of next step function. And in fact, we have functional encryption for Turing machines. So doesn't functional encryption for Turing machines already imply streaming FE? Why do we need this definition? And so it turns out that while they are similar, they don't necessarily imply each other. And the reason why is because a Turing machine computation, though it's iterative, only ever has one input given at the beginning and one output. Whereas in streaming FE, we have sort of adaptively chosen inputs at each step and different outputs at each step. So it's not quite so simple as making a minor tweak to, say, FE for Turing machine scheme to make it into a streaming FE scheme. The other direction works if the FE for Turing machines is required to have bounded size. So if you restrict the size of the tape used to be some down amount beforehand, then streaming FE implies that type of FE for Turing machines, but otherwise does not necessarily. Okay. Yeah, so back to our main theorem, what are these other terms I introduced? Compact simply means that the size of the setup and encryption algorithms for the functional encryption scheme do not depend on the size of the functions you want to generate function keys for. And this is not a new notion. This has been used in FE literature before. And then the other term is function selective. So what is this? And to talk about this, we'll have to dive back into our notion of security for a little bit more. So this type of security is talking about the order in which messages and queries are received during the security game. The best notion of security here would be adaptive security. So in the security game, the adversary gets a master public key, and then they can get function queries where they get a function key back, or they can send over two messages and they get encryption of one of them at random. And since it's adaptive, they can ask for any number of either function queries or message queries in any order they want. And then finally, the adversary outputs a guess for which encryption they receive. And one kind of interesting thing about streaming functional encryption is that although we only have one pair of challenge message streams, each stream consists of multiple encryptions. So because there's multiple elements to this. So what we are actually allowing you is to ask for function queries in the middle of asking for encryption of the stream. So for instance, you could ask for an encryption of the first 4 slots of the stream, then a function query, and then encryption for the next 3 slots. So you can intersperse even in that way. But yeah, so adaptive security is nice here. And as a note, just like with normal functional encryption, getting simulation security for public key streaming functional encryption is also impossible. So indistinguishability-based security is kind of the best. Okay. So unfortunately, historically, adaptive security is not something that's been achieved immediately. For example, with attribute-based encryption, it wasn't something we got right away. And unfortunately, we will follow in that kind of line of work in that we aren't able to achieve adaptive security immediately, although it's an important open problem and something we would like to get. So if we look at sort of what weaker notions of security we've started with to then build up to try to get adaptive security, a very common one is selective security, in which the message queries do not depend on the function queries. So in particular, you cannot ask for function queries until all the message queries have been done, because otherwise you could choose the message queries based on the function queries. And actually what I've shown here is what's called semi-adaptive security, but I'm calling it selective security. So yeah, so this is sort of a weaker notion. And actually in our setting, it doesn't make quite as much sense. So if you recall, the point of streaming functional encryption was to allow you to encrypt and decrypt as the data became available. But here, if you see, all the function queries have to be asked after the message queries. So you can't start decrypting and using the function queries until the entire data stream is done. So that defeats the purpose a little bit of streaming function encryption. So rather than the selective security, we instead will use function selective security, which basically interchanges the roles of the function queries and the message queries. So here the function queries don't depend on the message queries, which means that the function queries must be asked before all the message queries. And again, you should think of this as morally similar to selective security, with just changing the function queries and message queries. And if you note here, right, the adversary could start decrypting as soon as they start receiving parts of the. So again, like I said, it's an open problem. We would love to get adaptive security, but what we prove is function selective. So that's what that definition means. And if you don't like function encryption, we can actually get these from very well-founded assumptions. So Jane, Lissa, Hai in their IO paper show how to build sublinear FE from well-studied assumptions. Then other work shows how to use this to build a compact FE scheme for P over poly. So as a corollary, we can build function selective streaming FE from the same assumptions used for IO, which are the D-lim assumption, KPRG, and C0 with constant stretch, and the D-lim assumption. And since we're using kind of this IO paper result for the corollary, you might be wondering, like, why don't you just use IO? I mean, IO is so powerful, prove everything with IO. So it's kind of addressed a couple of things there. It's not immediately obvious how to use IO to build streaming epi. So if you're just like, well, IO, just kind of apply IO and it works. It's a little bit more complicated than that. We're not really sure how to use it. And although IO does imply our scheme, because IO implies compact epi, which implies our streaming epi scheme by our main theorem, we don't actually use IO at all in our construction. So if you had a compact epi scheme, then you could, get our scheme. And in fact, going from functional encryption to IO incurs kind of a bigger losses. So while IO does imply our scheme, we don't use IO. We don't need IO. Okay. So there's a result. And unfortunately, for the sake of time, I won't have time to go into the details of how the construction works. But you can see our full version of our paper. And also, I have included the end of the slides, which are posted online, an appendix, which has some details of some of the construction. So you can take a look at those afterwards if you like. But just as a couple high-level comments about it, some of the problems we had to run into was we had to write this recursive definition that we had to break apart to no longer be recursive. And then we had circular security issues, part of which we solved by using our exactly. But you can ask me for more details after the call. So I'll just leave a couple open problems. So it would be nice to get adaptive security, as I mentioned. And in fact, we don't even know how to get adaptive security when we restrict it to a very weak, in this case, a secret key FE scheme that's only required to be secure for a single key and a single second. In fact, actually, if you could get it in that setting, then we could build adaptive streaming FE in the general setting. Next, we would like to maybe consider extensions work. Like in this case, multi-stream, so computing on multiple streams at once. We can consider FE for other types of iterative processes. So in streaming functional encryption, you have sort of linear chain of dependencies. What if it was kind of different? And then lastly, we could maybe look at streaming models for other types of things. Yeah, thank you.
Good, very nice results. We have time for some questions. If anybody has any questions?
The majority? Yeah.
It seems like comparatively allowing streams to meet some legislation is you're looking at absolutely.
Yeah, so I guess the question is,
Repeat the question.
yeah, I'll repeat the question. So the question was back to the example where I said about the majority, it seems that you're leaking more than regular functional encryption because you're outputting the majority at every step. So I guess to sort of address that, you could have a function where you say, for the first n steps, output nothing and then output the majority. So the fact that you can additionally output y's at every step doesn't mean you have to output a y at every step. So I guess it depends on what you want. If you want an output every step, or you could say don't output something at some steps.
So that was going to be my question. Do you think you could weaken the model so that you could actually achieve some security guarantees? Because you were struggling with that.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I guess it would maybe be related to sort of the functional encryption for Turing machines. So yeah, if we sort of required only one output at the end, and somehow it knew that it was the very last output, we would still have the problem of having an input at every step, which we'd have to get around. But that might be one way to try to get to it.
Great. Any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you for the interesting talk, and maybe this could be a question related to your answer. But what if the Bob wants to just get them returned from some selected functions among the streamed functions like F1 or F5 or F7? Is it required to have the oldest hypertext for the streaming functions, or would it be possible for Bob to only decrypt some selective ciphertext and encapsulation.
Okay, so I think kind of you're asking like, what if you wanted to maybe skip some elements of the encryption or maybe start in the middle at like number 5. So currently how it's defined is you cannot skip elements and you can't start arbitrarily in the middle. You could sort of encrypt, null values for intermediate things, but right now there is no way of skipping intermediate elements or starting in.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you. That's one for you. Okay, we have one more talk. So our next talk is going to be on attribute-based multi-input functional encryption and more from attribute-weighted sums. This is work by Shweta Agarwal, Junichi Tomita, and Anshu Yadav. And Junichi is going to talk. Yours. Can you hear me? Jokes in the meantime. So, well, thank you for introduction. This is joint work with Shweta and Michelle. I'm brainstorming. That doesn't work. Sure. So if you use this equipment, oh, but it doesn't change. Changing here is continuing. Oh. Okay, success.
Thank you for waiting.
Good to go. All right, what was yours?
So let me start with a motivated example. So there are several hospitals, each of which has its own medical database, and they are encrypted security reasons. They are planning to some subscription service to joint data analysis. So some researcher or doctors pay money and some authority gave him a right to data analysis. And it maybe depends on the cases, but in some cases, maybe the newer data will be more valuable. For example, in the case of surveillance, COVID-19, maybe people is more people is interested in the latest data. But this example might be and so anyway, the subscription fee will be would depend on what kind of data analysis can be performed and which data can be used for analysis. And each key should be able to control these above these 2 points. So more precisely, maybe it is desirable if the key is associated with some predicated key and function f, and this key allows users to run f of d1, d2, d3 if and only if the predicate satisfies in this case the time period is some associated data, and if this time period is this time period satisfies the predicate. And in this case, for example, if it corresponds to some positive rate over d1, d2, d3, and P is a predicate that is satisfied if and only if T1, T2, and T3 is located in some time period or range. And in this situation, the first cryptographic primitive that comes to mind will be a multi-input functional encryption. And this consists of 4 algorithms. Set of algorithms generate a public key and multiple encryption keys and master secret key. And the encryption algorithm takes a encryption key and plain text and outputs the ciphertext for the corresponding zone. And the third algorithm is a key generation algorithm, which takes master secret key and some function f and outputs the secret key. And decryption of the ciphertext and secret key only reveals the f of x1 to xn and nothing else. And if we have a multi-functional encryption for general circuits, then we can solve the motivating scenario. But it is known that MIT for general circuits are known so far prohibitively complex and inefficient. And recently it turned out that we can construct it from standard assumptions or well-studied assumptions, but still needs multiple assumptions. So it is also important to explore simpler and direct constructions for some specific functionality from a single assumption. And in this line of works, MIP for inner products for quadratic functions are included. And recently, the notion of multi-input attribute-based encryption is also introduced, and this is also considering the line of the latter works. And the syntax is the same as MIFE, except that encryption algorithm takes an attribute in addition to plain text. And the secret key is associated with predicate P instead of function M. And the decryption of the ciphertext and secret key reveals if and only if a predicate is satisfied, the decryption outputs the entire x1 to xn. And recently, Agrawal et al. Presented the direct construction of MIAB for MC1. But this cryptographic primitive does not allow some data analysis because it's a all or nothing type of encryption. So, but we are interested in this work with a more generalized notion, which is called the attribute-based MIP, which is the same as MIAB, except that secret key is associated additionally to some function. Sorry. In addition to a predicate key, secret key is also associated with function F. And decryption outputs f of x1 to xn only if predicate is satisfied by these attributes. And it is not hard to see that MIAB is a special case of ABMIP, and so MIAB can be captured as ABMIP for identity function. Our contribution in this paper is basically twofold. The first one is construction of ABMIP for predicate plus conjunction of MSD1 and function plus attribute weighted sum. And second one is construction of a more generalized notion, which is called multi-client AP and dynamic decentralized AP for attribute weighted sum. But due to the time constraint, I will talk about only the item 1 in this talk. Okay, so I will next explain the security notion ABMIP. And this is basically the same as the security for multi-function encryption. So consider the point game. First, adversary is obtaining a public key, and then adversary can make 3 queries. First one is a corruption query, which allows the adversary to run some encryption keys. The second one is an encryption query, which adversary outputs attribute and 2 messages, and encryption oracle encrypts the plain text for the change bit. The third one is the key generation query. So adversary outputs a predicate and function, and it's obtains the corresponding secret. And if adversary cannot get a big D in the meaningful probability, the scheme is secure. In this work, we consider a selective variant of security, in which adversary first commits all corrupted encryption slot and all Chinese ciphertext. And I will next explain some weaker variant of the security to explain our to compare our work with previous work. First one is no corruption. And in this security notion, adversary cannot make corruption queries. And second one is no merge challenge setting, in which the adversary can make at most 1 ciphertext query per each slot. And this notion is very weak, because if adversary obtains more than 1 ciphertext of the same slot, then security may break down. The third one is no corruption and no non-collision resistance. In this setting, the adversary can only make at most 1 secret key query. And this notion is also weak, because if adversary obtains more than 1 key, then the security may break down. So let me compare our work with previous work. First, I will compare our scheme to previous MIAB scheme. The first one is the MIAB scheme proposed by Agrawal et al. And the point is that this scheme is not corruption resistant. Concurrently, Francati et al. Presented 2 MIAB schemes, And these have trade-off between the number of RT and the corruption resistance. But these works does not secure against corruption attack and collision attack simultaneously. And concurrently, our work, a collaborator also presented MIAB for predicate plus P, but still this construction does not resist to corruption. And our scheme is the first MIAB, can be seen as a MIAB scheme that that is secure against corruption attack and collision attack. And also our work with not MIAB but other based MIAB. So our scheme has more broad can handle more broad approach. But our scheme is merchant secure in this thing. Next, I will compare our scheme with previous ABMIF scheme. And the only known ABMIF scheme so far is that by Gwen et al. And our work with has an advantage over their scheme with respect to the threshold F and merchant security. And both scheme is secure against corruption attack and collision attack. So in summary, our scheme can be seen as the first MIAB schemes secure against these three attacks. And the second, our scheme is the first ABMI scheme that is secure under merge change. And the third, our scheme is the first ABMI scheme beyond the inner product function. So I will next explain our predicate class and function class. The conjunction in NC1, which is a predicate class of our scheme, can be described as follows. The predicate P in this class is specified by n predicates in NC1, and this predicate is satisfied if all predicate is satisfied. And this predicate class is sufficient for the motivating scenario because the predicate which is satisfied if the time period is located in some range can be expressed by conjunction in NC. And attribute weighted sums is a function class that is recently introduced by Abdullah. And in this functionality, message consists of public part and private part. And encryption only hides the private part. And the function, AWS function is represented by NC1 circuit, and the f of x is defined as the weighted sum of private parts by defining the weights to be the 0 by I. And the motivation of this functionality is that, for example, from this database, we can compute the average salary of doctors, for example, by setting GY to be a predicate that is satisfied only if I is doctor. And multi-input AWS is defined as follows. First, computer AWS for each slot, and then sum them up for all slots. So finally, I will explain our challenges in this work. So I will explain for the case of inner product for simplicity. And the first starting point will be multi-input FE for inner products. That is secure hands multi-challenge attack. And this scheme is constructed by gluing any single input FE for inner product together. But gluing is homomorphism in the ciphertext of underlying scheme. More concretely, ciphertext of x plus y is equal to ciphertext of x plus y. Such homomorphism is necessary for this strategy. But in the attribute-based setting, this strategy does not work because corresponding homomorphism does not work in the attribute-based setting. So our strategy is to use a function hiding property instead of homomorphism. And actually, previous work for function hiding MIFE is constructed from function hiding single input FE by gluing in instances. And this, in the case of function hiding scheme, gluing uses the function hiding feature instead of ciphertext of it. And our the main observation is that this function hiding feature can be adapted to attribute-based setting because this does not use ciphertext. This is the main idea of our work. And we can extend this technique to AWS functionality. So in conclusion, we constructed MIFE for attribute-weighted sums in this work. And this is the first ABMIFE with full-fledged security, and the first ABMIFE beyond inner product functionality. And we also constructed other extensions, although I couldn't talk in these topics. That's it. Thank you very much.
Great, we have time for one question before we do changing tracks. So is the constructions use usually not so
Just only pairing and others.
You could do presumably more.
I think so, but not seriously.
Great. Any other questions? No, I think let's thank the speaker.
Thank you very much.
We'll break until 2:55 and then we'll start the track again. Yeah. So how do you play with the secret? How do you play with the secret? Speaker here. Sure. Is Cody here? Minutes. Yeah, we're having fun here. Technical problems. Are we gonna be set also for the second talk, or are we gonna have problems? Yep, what's that? Right there, 208? 298. You get the chat sent to here. Cody, you're good to go? Yeah. You mic'd up? No. Okay, we need to get mic'd up. Yep, all right, so guys, put it over here, please.
Hello? Sounds right.
You
Uh,
wanna try? Yeah, perfect.
is there like a place for me to look or?
Audience.
Okay. Okay.
Not yet, not yet. Let's start.
Yeah.
Start in 20 seconds. Okay. All right, so let's get started. So we stay on track. All right, so the second half of this of the functional encryption track, we have two talks. First talk is on how to use plain witness encryption, registered AV, flexible broadcast, and more by Cody Freitag, Matt Waters, and David Lu. Cody, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll be talking about how to use just plain witness encryption. I'll focus on the case of flexible broadcast today. And as I said, this is joint work with Brent Waters and David Lu, and I'm Cody. Okay, so to start things off, I just want to overview the broad landscape of off-use-topia. At a high level, this is everything we've learned how to build from indistinguishability obfuscation since its introduction more than 20 years ago. And we've shown a bunch of different cool, exciting, advanced cryptographic applications in all different areas of cryptography with different application settings, which is really exciting. And even more exciting, we actually have candidate constructions for I/O based on kind of well-founded assumptions, even some plausible candidates that are post-quantum secure. So this really shows that kind of the last couple decades of research have been fruitful for this kind of crazy, novel off-use-topia that once was kind of a dreamscape. So where are the obfuscation startups? So that might be a question that a lot of people, especially practitioners out there, might be asking after we've kind of declared success in so many of these areas. Well, it turns out there's a couple caveats with this landscape as we know it. The first is that we have these candidate constructions for I/O, but they're still woefully inefficient. A lot of them kind of first build just slightly non-trivial versions of I/O and kind of recursively apply the same technique over and over again. And very quickly, this blows up any sort of practical parameters, making any hope of this being practical in the near future very unlikely. The second is our current constructions rely on various kind of strong sub-exponential type assumptions that in a lot of aspects of cryptography, we want to kind of clean this up as much as possible, rely on polynomial time assumptions, or have kind of simple to state assumptions as much as possible. And so in our work, we ask what can be built from both weaker assumptions and potentially more efficient primitives that lie in kind of what is currently seen as in this off-use-topia landscape. And towards doing so, we're going to look at a particular promising avenue of witness encryption. And the reason is because there's been several recent works that have given new constructions from seemingly weaker assumptions that are what are needed to build I/O. In particular, there's a candidate from this evasive LWE assumption giving witness encryption, and we don't know how to kind of build full I/O from this. There's also evidence that these constructions are much simpler and more efficient than IO, not quite efficient, but at least it seems there's promise to kind of maybe build witness encryption much more efficiently than any current candidate IO scheme. And lastly, witness encryption, at least in some formal sense, is provably weaker than IO, meaning we don't know, or we can prove that you can't, in a black box way, build IO from witness encryption. So in our work, kind of guided by this promising avenue, we construct a new framework for using witness encryption to build some primitives that were previously only known to be built from indistinguishability obfuscation. And to kind of position this framework, I first want to contrast it with an existing framework based on IO, which uses the kind of very heavy hammer of indistinguishability obfuscation with a particular style of hash function called a somewhat statistically binding hash function. And a lot of techniques for applications of IO kind of combine these in a clever way in order to get these obfustopia primitives. And in contrast, we're going to kind of somewhat weaken the IO requirements and IO primitive to a kind of weaker hammer of witness encryption. And along the way, we'll come up with a slightly more expressive hash function, which we call a function binding hash function, that combined with witness encryption can give some of these obfustopia primitives. And this function binding hash, I think, is a new contribution we defined and use in this work that I think hopefully will have some interesting applications in the future. So now to state some of our main results in a little more detail, first we show how to build this function binding hash function for a particular class of functions from the learning with errors assumption. And very high level, we use actually similar techniques to the original somewhat statistically binding hash function construction from the Kubitschek-Witz paper. Second, given this function binding hash function and witness encryption, we build a variety of applications like registered attribute-based encryption, flexible broadcast encryption, and optimal broadcast encryption in the random oracle model. I'll get into a little more about the top two in a second. But I want to emphasize that kind of we get all three of these in a mostly generic technique that combines this function binding hash and witness encryption in a similar way to SSB hashing and IO. And combined, this shows from learning with errors and witness encryption how to build these various groups. Lastly, I want to mention we also show a relationship between registered attribute-based encryption and flexible broadcast encryption, showing which in particular, based on recent work, gives the similar transformation, gives a distributed broadcast protocol from pairings with large CRS that we're talking about. But I won't mention this too much in the talk today. So to further expand on kind of the some of our results in more detail, I want to give a detour into an area which I'll call trustless cryptography. In particular, we'll look at the specific setting of functional encryption, which you can think of as a way to augment kind of your standard public key encryption with fine-grained decryption capabilities. And while functional encryption in its own right and has many applications, it has a key limitation where the secret keys are typically required to be issued by a central trusted authority. And so recently there's been a push to remove kind of this need for a central trusted authority in these advanced encryption systems for like full functional encryption or restricted classes of functional encryption. And to give some examples, for example, for identity-based encryption, there's a notion of register-based encryption, where users, instead of getting their keys from a trusted authority, can generate their own keys, and you just need a central aggregator to kind of aggregate users' keys together. Similarly, this has been kind of shown for attribute-based encryption and full functional encryption. Additionally, for broadcast encryption, where you want to send a message to an arbitrary set of users, there's a notion of distributed or flexible broadcast, which I'll get into a bit later in the talk, that asks, can individual users generate their own keys as opposed to relying on a central trusted authority to distribute these keys? And prior to our work, kind of the state of the art was, well, from the kind of simplest functionality of identity-based encryption and its trustless variants, we could build this from simple assumptions like computation with the Hellman or LWE, but anything more expressive, it seemed like we needed full-fledged indistinguishability obfuscation to build this. And now in our work, we show for these two examples of trustless systems, registered ABE and distributed and flexible broadcast, how to build these from witness encryption instead. Okay, so that's the kind of overview of our results. For the rest of the day, I want to zoom in on the case of flexible broadcast to show our framework of how to build it from witness encryption and these function binding hash functions, which I'll define in a bit. And so the plan is first just to formally define witness encryption. Second, define this new notion of flexible broadcast that we define in this work, which is kind of a trustless variant of broadcast encryption. And third, I'll show how to actually build flexible broadcast from witness encryption. And naturally, it'll come up how this function binding hash function comes into play. Okay, so first starting with witness encryption. So to define the syntax and correctness of a witness encryption scheme, well, there's an encryption algorithm that takes in a message and also a relation, an NP relation with some particular instance X for the relation. And with that, it produces some ciphertext. And the decryption algorithm, given the ciphertext and the witness, basically should output the message if the witness satisfies this relation. Security says the only properties required is if X is not in the language. So if the ciphertext was generated for an invalid instance with respect to the relation, then encryptions of some arbitrary message of your choice should be indistinguishable from something unrelated like an encryption of 0. In terms of efficiency, we require that the size of the ciphertext is polynomial, not only in the security parameter in the size of the message, but also in the size of the relation. So we allow a polynomial dependence in the size of the relation. Now, I want to give you two different ways of thinking of witness encryption. The first is kind of thinking of it as a generalization of public key encryption, where your public key is kind of the instance X for the relation, and the secret key is the witness needed to satisfy the relation, which also gives you a way to recover the message. Another way of thinking about this is thinking about the ciphertext as kind of a weak form of an obfuscated program. And this framing kind of frames witness encryption closer to how IO actually will get used a lot of times. And in this lens, you can think of the ciphertext that depends on the relation, the instance, and the message as a program that, given the witness, outputs the message if it satisfies the relation, or just nothing otherwise. And the kind of the obfuscation in this program is just the fact that this message stays hidden if X is not in the language. And importantly, only the message is being hidden, and there's no actual computation being hidden. And if we try to increase the power of this kind of obfuscation form and try to hide any other computation or anything else, which has been done, for example, for variants of witness encryption like positional witness encryption, it seems like very quickly you'll get closer to just full-fledged IO, whereas we want to stay to kind of just a plain notion of witness encryption that seems to be weaker than IO. Okay, and so our goal, as I said before, is how we're going to build this notion of flexible broadcast encryption from witness encryption. So flexible broadcast encryption first starts with some setup algorithm that produces some public parameters in the sky. And then each individual user is able to generate a pair of keys for themselves given these public parameters. And they'll post the public key onto the bulletin board that everyone can see. Then Alice comes along and she wants to communicate with an arbitrary subset of these users. So she posts a ciphertext to the bulletin board that any of the users could read, as well as information to convey which users she wants to talk to. In particular, she'll share which are the public keys needed for the users she's communicating with. Okay, so in terms of syntax and correctness, we require that first, this ciphertext is allowed to depend on the message and the set of public keys that Alice wants to communicate to. And the decryption algorithm gets the ciphertext, a particular secret key for one of these public keys, and knows the set of users Alice wanted to talk to, and outputs the message if the secret key corresponds to one of the public keys in this set. At a very high level, security should say something like, unless you have a secret key for one of these public keys, then encryptions of a message should be indistinguishable from something unrelated, like an encryption 0. You can ask various forms of adaptivity and selectivity in different parts of the definition, but for the purpose of today's talk, I'll just focus on this kind of high-level notion of security. And lastly, the efficiency requirement to make this non-trivial is that the size of the ciphertext should depend logarithmically on the size of the set. In other words, the only set information should be this list of public keys, and there should be nothing that kind of depends on the set and the message at the same time, because the size of the ciphertext should depend on only on the size of the message, only logarithmically on the size of the set. And why this is trustless is the fact that the users are generating their own keys here. In standard broadcast encryption, a central authority will kind of generate keys for the users, which allows further coordination, which we want to avoid. And this is also in contrast to a very related notion of distributed broadcast, where kind of there's a priori setup where each user is assigned a particular index. So kind of we're considering the kind of most bare bones setting where users don't have to coordinate at all. They just generate their public keys and post them on the bulletin. Okay, so this is the goal of what we want to build from witness encryption. And doing so will show our general framework for how to use witness encryption. Okay, so the first attempt I want to go through to kind of show where the big picture of our framework works is we'll consider the setting where in the public parameters, we'll just store a public key for a public key encryption scheme. And then to generate keys, each user will just generate an encryption under this public key for an encryption of 1. And the secret key associated with each user's public key will just be the randomness used to generate this encryption of 1. So clearly, each user can generate these encryptions themselves, keep their own secret keys. Now I need to tell you how Alice will actually broadcast a message to an arbitrary subset of these users. So to generate the ciphertext, what she'll do is she'll use witness encryption for a particular relation to generate the ciphertext. This relation will consist of an instance that's just the size, the set of all public keys she wants to send to. A witness will just be any particular individual secret key corresponding to one of these public keys. And the relation just makes sure that one of these secret keys satisfies one of the, or the secret key satisfies one of the public keys. It's not too hard to see that by correctness of witness encryption, that this will actually be correct. Basically, if you know one of the secret keys, you'll be able to provide the witness that reveals the message from the ciphertext. In terms of security, well, we'll show this through a hybrid argument, where first, we'll kind of switch to a hybrid where for all the users in the set, instead of having encryptions of 1 on the bulletin board, we'll switch to encryptions of 0. And the kind of intuition is if someone doesn't have any of these secret keys, by just public key encryption security, this will be indistinguishable. And then we'll just switch the ciphertext above to an encryption of 0, something unrelated. And the point is that kind of this relies on the ability to switch the witness encryption message, relies on the fact that the instance X should not be an L, which means there's no witness that satisfies this relation. And essentially, if all of these encryptions are encryptions of 0, then there's no way to provide a single randomness that will open any of them to be an encryption of 1. And so in fact, this scheme, as stated, is totally secure. Okay, so where's the issue? Well, the issue is in terms of efficiency. Basically, the size of the ciphertext depends on the size of the relation, and the relation kind of consists of all the public keys, and so necessarily will depend on the size of the set. And so in contrast, for efficiency to be non-trivial for broadcast encryption, we want this to be kind of sublinear or ideally logarithmic in the size of the set. So efficiency doesn't hold. So our trick to kind of get around this problem of efficiency is to use efficient set membership. Instead of directly checking whether the secret key is valid for one of the public keys, we'll try to kind of efficiently check whether there exists some public key that you know is before. And the way we'll do this is with Merkle trees. So these are hash functions that provide a local opening guarantee that allow you to efficiently prove that you know something in the set. So with this, we'll change the relation for the witness encryption, where instead of the instance consisting of the set of public keys, we'll first hash down all of the public keys into a fixed size digest that's much smaller. And the witness for this relationship will consist of a secret key just as before, as well as kind of a proof that you know one of the corresponding public keys that were hashed down. And then the relation just checks that the public key is indeed valid as before, and also checks that you have a valid opening for a public key with respect to the digest. And again, it's not too hard to see that this will be correct. In terms of efficiency, we've solved our problem from before because the size of the relation now doesn't depend on the whole set. In fact, by efficiency of the Merkle tree will only depend logarithmically on the size of the set. So efficiency holds. But now we have an issue with security. If we try the same approach where we switch all of these public keys to be encryptions of 0 instead of encryptions of 1, we have no guarantee that the instance X is not in the language. Namely, because kind of Merkle trees or hash functions in general, they're compressing. It very well could be the case that you could open up an encryption of 1, even if you originally just hash down encryption of 0. And we really need a statistical property in order to that X is not in the language in order to invoke the witness encryption security. The security does not hold. Okay, so our solution to this will be this new primitive that we define, which I'll call a function binding hash, which hopefully will be clear what that means in a second. But mainly based on our previous kind of attempt at constructing this flexible broadcast scheme, what we want from this hash function is 1, just like a Merkle tree, it should be a multi-input hash function. 2, it should still provide local openings in order to get the proper efficiency properties we need. And lastly, we want the property, just based on what I described before, that if the leaves for this tree or for the inputs to this hash function are all encryptions of 0, it should be impossible statistically to open anything, to local open anything that's an encryption of 1. And if we could satisfy all of these properties, then we would be able to push our argument through from before. Okay, so to see this in a little more detail, we'll look at a particular digest for a hash function with respect to some hash key and a sequence of inputs x1 to xn. And to motivate this, I'll recall the notion of a somewhere statistically binding hash function that basically gives you a way to sample the hash key in a particular way with respect to an index that is binding to a particular input x of I. So in particular for SSB hash, if you bind to index I and you hash down the value that contains xi at position I, it should be impossible to open up to any other input xi prime that's different from xi. And the reason that SSB hash only looks at a single index at a time is because kind of if you want the hash function to be compressing, you can't kind of be statistically binding on larger than the size of the hash. So our key idea is instead of binding just a single input of the function, we're going to bind to a function of the inputs. And in particular, if the output of the function that we're binding to is small, then we don't get any impossibility, and this should potentially be possible. A little more formally, this says if you can provide a proof, if there exists a proof that opens up this digest to some value xi prime at position I, then there must exist an extension of values such that f applied to x1 prime to xn prime is equal to f applied to the original values used to compute this digest. A little more succinctly, it says you can only open to consistent values. So you can't open to anything inconsistent with the value of the function on your original inputs x1 to xn. So then for our application, we're going to construct a function binding hash for a particular family of functions that include this function that just takes the OR of a bunch of decryptions with respect to the public key encryption scheme that we had before. And the point here, why kind of this function is useful to bind to, is this guarantees if your original inputs were all encryptions of 0, then the output of this function will be 0 for all of these inputs. And therefore, it would be inconsistent to open to an encryption of 1 at any of the leaves. And so because any encryption of 1 is inconsistent, that means there must not exist statistically any proofs that open to encryptions of 1. Very briefly, again, this kind of goes through the construction of proof-checked wicks, where you kind of construct a Merkle tree, where you kind of use FHE to kind of evaluate first this decryption function at all the leaves, and then you can homomorphically propagate the kind of OR of each of the children down to the roots. So if you're familiar with proof-checked wicks, this is kind of the high level of how this is actually constructed. 1 minute. Okay. And yeah, the point is we plug in this hash function into where we had the Merkle tree before. Correctness and efficiency hold just as before. For security, after switching to all the encryption to 0, again, we now have the X is not in the language, and so we can apply to the witness encryption security to switch to something unrelated and finish the proof. The security holds. So yeah, just to recap, today I focused on the example of flexible broadcast. We also show registered ABE and optimal broadcast in the same general framework, and the relationship between registered ABE and flexible broadcast. Refer to the paper for the details of the other results, and also recall that the top 2 examples are kind of these trustless encryption systems that previously were only known from an asynchronous obfuscation. In terms of open problems, I'll quickly just say, I think this notion of function binding hash is very interesting. Can we build function binding hash functions for other classes of families? And also, can we use this in new applications? In particular, I want to point out that earlier today, we saw a paper building snarks for monitoring policy batch NP using a very related notion in kind of a completely separate context that just happened to kind of be motivated in the same way. So yeah, I definitely recommend looking at that paper, and I think this is at least some evidence that these ideas will be useful kind of moving forward in different areas. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the wonderful talk. Let's see, we can take one question. Anybody has a question?
I was wondering that in your decryption algorithm seems to take the list of public keys or round numbers in the set. And I don't see how you would get that with a linear in the size of the set communication.
Yeah, so the goal is that the size of the ciphertext should not depend on the size of the set, but we do allow the size, like the set information, to be encoded in the public keys. If the ciphertext plus public keys in general is smaller than the size of the set, I believe it should be impossible to come up with a decryption algorithm. So it's more important that kind of the product of the size of the set and the size of the message doesn't appear. It's kind of treated independently in this notion of in broadcast encryption in general and in this notion of flexible broadcast. So if you have a really large message that you're communicating, that shouldn't be multiplied by the number of people you're talking to, because you're kind of treated as separate pieces, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Thank you very much. Okay, the last talk of this session is on constant inputs attribute-based encryption. This then predicate encryption from evasive and tensor WE. Vishnu Dagwal, Melissa Rossi, Anshu Yajal, Dimitri Lemas. I'm sure it's meeting time.
So, no. Welcome to my talk on constructing constant input attribute based and predicate encryption from evasive and tensor ambiguity. This is joined with Shweta Agarwal, medicine, and Shweta. So to begin with an example, consider there is a medical researcher who wants to perform a certain study on medical records of certain patients in a certain group. So she needs access to records of patients from the hospital. And the medical records being sensitive information, the hospital administrator would like to provide restricted access so that the researcher can access only the records of those patients which are relevant to her study. And as we know, attribute-based encryption is a primitive for this, where the encryption, any message is encrypted with respect to an attribute X, which in this example can be age and the medical condition of the patient. And the keys are generated with respect to a function. So here the function can define the group of the patients which the researcher wants to study. And the decryption is possible if and only if fx is equals to. In the most secure notion of predicate encryption, the ciphertext hides the attributes as well. So now in this example, we are implicitly assuming that the records of any patient are stored at a central entity, while in reality, the picture may be different. So for example, the records of a single patient may be distributed across different departments. And therefore, what we want is that each department should be able to encrypt the data locally and independently. And key should be given with respect to function that computes on the attributes from both the departments. And for the decryption, we want that these independently generated ciphertext we should be able to combine them as if they are from a single source. So more formally, so now message and attribute, for example, here are distributed in three users, and each user generates ciphertext independently. And the key is given, for example, here for the 3-arity function, which evaluates on x1, x2, x3. And what we want is that the decryption should take this key as input and these independently generated ciphertext. And think of this as encryption coming from a single source. And the underlying messages should be recovered if and only if x1, x2, x3 is 1. And for security, we want that these ciphertext should look pseudo. So in related work in this area, so even though this multi-input attribute-based encryption has practical importance, first formal treatment was given very recently by Agarwal and et al., and where we constructed 2-input ABE for NCMN class circuit from LWE and parents. And in the same paper, construction for poly class circuit was also given, but the proof was invested, security proof was invested. Then the work by Agarwal et al. That Junichi talked about in the previous talk, that implies a poly-input AB for conjunctions in NC1 from MDDH. And in our work, we construct constant input attribute-based encryption for much more general class of NC1 circuits from recently introduced assumption of evasive LWE. This assumption was introduced by Hotek V and Sabri in independent work. And we also construct constant input ABE for class P using evasive and a generalized form of tensor LWE, which again was introduced by Hotek V. And if we restrict our the arity to 2 for class P, we can make this by using the tensor LWE next stage. And all these work provide collusion resistance, which means that the adversary can be given secret keys for more than one function. So there is another work by Franchetti et al., which constructs a poly-input AB, but that does not support collusion resistance, meaning that the adversary can get secret key for only one function. So here are our results. This I already talked about. We construct constant input multi-input AB for NC1B. glass circuits. And by using compiler from A.Y. Agrawal et al., that basically takes any constant input ABE and gives us constant input predicate encryption from an ABE, we get a multi-input or constant input predicate encryption in these settings. And in our paper, we also study the tensor LW assumption, and we showed that the tensor LW can in fact be reduced to standard LW in certain specialties. This gives us more insight into the assumption. So before going into the details of the construction, let us try to understand what is so difficult about MLABE, that this was basically, there was no work very recently. So this basically requires satisfying two opposite requirements. On the one hand, we want the encryptors to encrypt independently. But on the other hand, we want these independently generated ciphertexts to be correlated in a meaningful way so that the decryption can be performed. And this is basically, and since these are independently generated, we don't like getting correlation is difficult. So here is a pathway for our intuition to this work. So it begins with Agrawal and Yamada's construction for succinct CPAB in 2020, which uses Boneh et al.'s key policy ABE as the basic, and nice properties of this KPAB and its structure. And in this work, Agrawal and Yamada generated new techniques, and one of these uses pairings, which basically hides BGG plus ciphertext components in the exponent. And then later on in 2022, we realized that the same techniques can be used in a different setting of multi-input ABE. And here, basically, what we did that we also used pairings now to again hide these ciphertext components in the exponent, and re-randomize it with trash randomness. So user 1 randomizes it with R1 in the exponent. User 2 randomizes the ciphertext with R2. And when we take pairings, we get basically BGG plus ciphertext components in the exponent, but with common randomness. But since pairings have inherent limitation of allowing only one multiplication, we were fundamentally stuck at parity 2. Then in 2022, we constructed ciphertext policy ABE. Again, using BGG plus KPAB as the basic structure, and similar ideas as AY20. But now instead of pairings, he used tensoring, basically to perform similar operation of hiding these ciphertext components. And now since, and he gave nice abstraction of assumptions that help us to get his construction. And now the question is that since tensoring does not have such limitation, basically we can perform tensoring any number of times. The question is, can we now get multi-input KPAB with higher array? And in fact, we answer this question in positive. That is, we construct constant input KPAB for NC1 and P from evasive and tensor LW. And we get P for same settings using A and B. So very quick review of tensor products. So given two matrices A and B, so basically tensoring multiplies each element of matrix A with matrix P. And we use the following relation. So A tensor B times C tensor D basically gives us AC tensor B. And this implies following A tensor I times I tensor R transpose. So if you want to get A tensor I transpose, we can get like this. And similarly, the second relation, A tensor R times B gives us KB tensor. So let us look at the high level idea of BGG plus ciphertext. So it uses a homomorphism that says that given a matrix A and binary vector X and a function F, there exists a short low norm efficiently computable matrix H such that A minus X tensor G, right, multiplied by H is equals to AF minus FXG. And this matrix AF can be computed publicly using A and function F. And we can see that if Fx is equals to 0, this basically gives us AF. Now with this relation in hand, the encryption is basically S times A minus X tensor G. So A minus X tensor G is basically concatenation of AI minus Xig, where Xi is the ith bit of Fx. And S is a fresh random secret. So we can see that if we multiply this term with H on the right side, we get SAF if Fx is equals to 0. And when Fx is equals to 0, this basically is used to mask the message. And the key is then a way so that this mask can be recovered. This is basically a short pre-image with respect to A for some public vector U. Now, evasive and tensor LWE. So evasive LWE is defined as follows. So we know LWE. LWE basically says that given a random matrix P, and then SB plus E, where S is a secret, is pseudo-random. Now, suppose the adversary is also given a short pre-image with respect to B for some arbitrary matrix P. Then, of course, the adversary can perform following computation. It can take the product of B inverse P and SB plus E. And this gives the adversary SP plus E prime. What evasive LWE says that this is the only way that that this extra information B inverse P can be used. So basically, if SP plus E prime is pseudo-random, then SB plus E remains pseudo-random even if B inverse P is given out. So this is defined as follows. Then tensor LWE says that correlated BGG plus ciphertext components when tensored with different random vectors remains pseudo-random. So here it is. So if given A and S A minus X tensor G is basically a BGG plus component, and if this is tensored with Ri transpose, and even if these random vectors are given out, these terms remain pseudo-random. So with these things in our tools in our hand, let us look at the high-level idea of the construction. So now we have attribute X, which is distributed amongst two users, X1 and X2. We want to get BGG plus ciphertext component, which is like this, S times A1 concatenated with X, A2 minus X1, X2 tensor G. So this is basically a concatenation of these two terms. And since user 1 knows X1, user 2 knows X2, these components can be distributed amongst these two users. But the problematic term is the secret S, which has to be common between both the users. But the question is, how can we make share this? So for example, if user 1 chooses the secret vector S, then how will the user 2 know what S is? So for this, what we can do is we can rewrite this as A2 minus X2 tensor G as SB times B inverse A2 minus X2 tensor G. Now, SB can be given out, and these dashed underlines basically represents the noisy term. So SB underline means SB plus. So user 1 can give out SB, and user 2 can give out B inverse A2 minus X2 tensor G. And at the time of decryption, we can take the product and get the BGG plus hypertext components, and we are back to the original. And therefore, the key is again same as BGG plus key, which is basically AF inverse of some public vector. Now, this brings us one step further ahead, but this is not secure. Basically, if the adversary gets suppose two ciphertext components from user 2, let's say for attribute X2 and X2 bar. So this gives us two BGG plus ciphertext for attribute X1, X2 and X1, X2 bar. But both of them are using same secret, which makes it insecure. So basically what we want is that these secret terms should be different for different ciphertext components, So using idea from B22, we want these S to be Si, which is S times I tensor Ri transpose. And now this Ri's will be chosen by user 2. So with this idea, this is the modification that we can make. Now the secret, instead of being just S, it is S times I tensor Ri transpose, where Ri is chosen by user. And we get the following form of BGG plus ciphertext. And now the second term, since Ri transpose is chosen by user 2, the user 2 can give out this. And notice that Ri transpose is also given out. So user 1 does not know Ri, but it does not even need to know at this stage. All it can do is make a placeholder for Ri transpose. And later on at the time of decryption, we can simply compute, right multiply the first ciphertext component with high tensor Ri transpose, which will give us the result. And now we are back to the original form of BGG plus ciphertext components with an added term Ri transpose. So we need to verify that does the homomorphism still hold, which indeed does. That is A minus X tensor G when tensored with R transpose, this right multiplied by little h gives us again AF minus FXG tensor R transpose. So this in fact works, and there is no direct attack on this, but when we try to formally prove the security, we are stuck at one point. So basically, while proving the security, we would like to get rid of these inverse terms, and for that we would like to use evasive LWE. But evasive LWE demands that the matrix for which the inverse is given, corresponding to which the inverse is given, that should be random. But AF is not random matrix; it is a structured matrix computed from A and F, and therefore we want to get rid of this. But what we notice is that the purpose of this key is basically to let the decryptor recover SAF when fx is equals to 0. So therefore, we can change modify the key as follows. So now the key is changed to B inverse of AF multiplied with again public vector tensor I. And now since user one is already giving out SP at the time of decryption, again, if we take product of these two terms, we get SAF, which is what was intended. So now this again brings us one step closer to the construction, but now we can apply evasive LWE. And after applying evasive LWE, basically we need to prove pseudo randomness of following terms. So here, basically, the first term is coming directly from user 1. SB is coming directly from here. This term basically comes from taking product of SP and B inverse this term. And similarly, SP times B inverse gives us the next term. So again, it looks like now we can apply tensor LWE. But again, the first and the last term are problematic because tensor LWE expects random matrices instead of these identity matrices. And therefore, what we again trick from B22 comes in handy, that we hide these terms using fresh LWE samples. So basically what we do, now the user 1 instead of giving out only this term hides it using S0 times A0 tensor I, where S0 is freshly sampled. Similarly, key is generated in a way so that after applying evasive LWE, the term that we get is not just this term, but this is masked with S1D tensor I. Notice that since the way we are computing this, basically we take the product of the key and the SB hint given from user 1. This S1 has to be sampled by user 1, and D is public. And with this modification, the first term is good, but again in the key, we see that there is no randomness coming from the key generator. And what it means is that suppose there are two keys generated for two functions, f and f bar. The mask remains the same. And if we are using same mask to hide two different things, then this is insecure. So what we want is that the key generator also to introduce some randomness. And this is what we do. So instead of having just D tensor I, we have D tensor T transpose tensor I, where T is freshly chosen by the key generator. And this, in fact, gives us the final secure scheme. We do need to do some more work so that at the time of decryption, we can remove this masking term. And so that defines the construction, which this works for NC1 and circuits. Now, I want to briefly talk about that if we restrict our circuit class to NC1, then evasive LWE suffices. And basically, where we use tensor LWE, we use tensor LWE to argue pseudo randomness of terms like this. But then we 22, we observed that if this term AI minus xi tensor GR, if they are low norm, then the pseudo-randomness of this term can be argued just by using LWE. And to make this term low norm, what changes can be made is that AI is now a low norm matrix and G is replaced with I. What we need to check is that does the homomorphism still hold? And in fact, it does. We have AI minus X tensor I, tensor R transpose multiplied by with H, gives us AF minus FX, this G should be I actually, tensor R transpose. And so with this modification, we can just do simplifications and prove the pseudo-randomness using LWE. One thing to notice is that in this homomorphism, H is low norm if only if F is in NC1, and therefore we are restricted to NC1 if we don't want to depend on NC1. So to summarize, we constructed constant arity ABE from evasive and tensor LWE. For NC1 circuits, only the evasive LWE assumption suffices. We also studied tensor LWE assumption and showed new implications. There are interesting open directions, like construction of constant arity multi-input AB from standard LWE, going beyond constant arity from maybe non-standard assumptions. And this construction does not support corruption. So corruption, meaning that these encryption algorithms uses the encryption key, which is secret. So corruption, we would like to support so that even if the encryption key of some of the users is leaked, can we get security? So that will be interesting. Thank you. So constant arity actually, for each user, we have this tensoring with random vector Ri. So the size is growing with users. So it grows exponentially with the number of users. And that's why we restricted it. Yeah, so with each user, we have a random vector. Yeah.
Right now, I'm